Like, I remember having to, like, shop for her flowers, which she's gonna get buried in, the casket, like, everything. Never did I think that I would, have to bury my youngest sister.
In 2014, 3 sisters died by suicide within 7 months of each other. Each had one thing in common: a First Nations child welfare agency in northwestern Ontario, Weechi-it-te-win Family Services. In the years since, the last surviving sister has been struggling to come to terms with all she has lost while in care.
Like, I can't call them up and tell them my problems. Like, I can't laugh with them. I'll never hear their laugh again. I'll never be able to hug them again. All of that's been taken from me.
It's no secret that Canada's child welfare system is in a state of crisis, or that it's Indigenous children who are paying the highest price. To this day, no one knows the total number of Indigenous kids in care, or how many have died there.
We have to ask ourselves, are our children not of value?
Canada's underfunding of First Nations child welfare is well known, but it's not only the federal government that's failing Indigenous children. First Nations child welfare agencies are assuming more and more responsibility over child welfare each year, and the numbers tell us they are repeating the same mistakes with the same deadly consequences.
These are lives we're talking about. This is our society, this is our culture, this is our community, these are our children.
Tonight, APTN Investigates brings you the story of 4 sisters, lost to a system meant to keep them safe. A report from an internal investigation we were never meant to see shows a child in care who was abused, neglected, and forgotten.
People need to know the truth on how Weechi-it-te-win really is. People needed to know, like, what happened to my sisters.
Now that she is aged out of the system, Robyn-Lee Mathers has strong opinions about her time in care of Weechi-it-te-win Family Services.
They're not in it because they care about the kids. They're in it just for a check. That's what it seems like. It always seemed like that.
And the role she feels the First Nations Child Welfare Agency played in the deaths of her 3 sisters.
They didn't send a counselor or anything to Sasha. They let Naya leave foster care too early. They weren't checking up on her or anything. As for Arizona, she grew up feeling angry against Weechi.
Robyn and her sisters Arizona, Shania, and Sacha Bob were all in the care of Weechi-it-te-win for most of their lives, under what's known as customary care agreements, a seemingly holistic approach to child welfare meant to keep Indigenous children connected to their family, culture, and community. Only that's not what's happening. Of all the deaths of Indigenous children in care in Ontario, more than half happened under First Nations child welfare agencies. And nearly all of the cases that APTN has reported on over the last few years were under customary care agreements.
I felt alone. And I always wondered where the heck they were. Like, what happened to them. And then I remember I was 6, maybe just 5 or something like that. It was in between those 2 years. And I was playing on my swing set at my grandparents'. And then I remember seeing my sister coming running down the road. And she was like, "Do you remember who I am?" She was just like excited to like see me. And I remember feeling like scared or something, like who is this kind of thing, because I kind of forgot like how she looked.
Weechi-it-te-win has been around since 1982. A First Nations child welfare agency that is purported to be one of the most progressive in the country, providing services to 10 local First Nations in northwestern Ontario. We were surprised to discover that their offices are located here, at the site of the old Fort Frances Indian Residential School. APTN first heard about Robyn's story through a leaked internal document. She was mentioned in a 73-page child death report by Weechi-it-te-win that outlined the life and death of Sacha Raven Bob, Robyn's youngest sister. Sasha was only 12 years old when she died by suicide at her grandfather's home on the Onigaming First Nation.
She had it hard. She had it really rough. My mom wasn't exactly the greatest person to Sasha. Like Sasha told me that, you know what Mom told me? She said that she came home drunk and she said, "I wasn't even supposed to have you. You weren't even supposed to be here," and just putting her down.
In Sasha's case, reading that report, it was shocking to me how many incidents were disclosed where she was dealing with sexual predators, where she was traumatized, where she was abused. And there was reaction in some of the cases, but not enough reaction to deal with the magnitude of what had happened.
Good morning, guys. Good morning. How are we doing today? Perfect. Awesome.
Sarah Lorich never got the chance to meet Sasha or her sisters, but she has heard similar accounts through her role as the executive director of the Advocacy Native Friendship Center.
You're welcome. Have a good
It's
day.
part of the reason she decided to share Sasha's death report with APTN.
I'm in crisis response because this is a crisis situation. And when I look at stories like Sasha's, the people who were at the helm, maybe it was normalized, maybe it was a shared history that they had, I don't know. It wasn't the crisis response that was required to adequately support her.
The death report highlights repeated failures and negligence by Weechi-it-te-win throughout Sasha's short life leading up to her death in care. It's hard to single out a specific example of where they failed to protect Sasha. There are far too many. Take, for instance, Sasha's plan of care. Those are supposed to happen every 3 months to address the needs of the child and assess the caregiver's responsibilities. For Sasha's entire 12 years in care, the report shows that there were 7 years where there were no plans of care in place.
It was a surreal experience because I understood, reading this report, that all of the warning signs were there. We were very clearly documenting all along the way in Sasha's life all of the reasons she should have had additional services and supports, additional love, care, and investment being provided to her.
And that only scratches the surface. The death report also notes 4 years with no annual medical checkups, a full year with no 90-day visits reported from her caseworkers at Weechi-it-te-win. Sasha also reported 3 separate occasions where she was sexually assaulted by underage boys. The police investigated, but no charges were laid. And while the report suggests that Weechi-it-te-win recommended counseling services to help Sasha deal with the trauma, there is no record that it was ever followed up with.
We're talking about a child who was hypersexualized, and we know why she was hypersexualized when we read that report. We get the answers to why these things happened and why we saw these outward appearance and these outward presentation things that were described in these different incidents. She was in pain. She was traumatized. She was being constantly traumatized. And to read it laid out like that in a death report for a suicide of a young child, this was a crisis and we needed to act like this was a crisis. And instead it was just like normalized and, you know, this is what happens and, you know, where can she live now?
But it wasn't only Sasha that was in a state of crisis. It was also her sisters. The report notes that Arizona and Sacha Bob combined had over 100 placements during their time in care of Weechi-it-te-win. Arizona eventually aged out of the system, and Weechi-it-te-win allowed Sacha to leave care voluntarily when she was only 16 years old. She died less than 2 years later in Thunder Bay from an apparent suicide.
I was like in shock, like I just kept saying that Naya's dead. I didn't know how or anything yet because no one knew. She just was dead. Then later on that evening, like we all found out like how, like she hung herself, allegedly.
Shania's death is now being reinvestigated. It's one of 9 sudden death cases where it has been alleged the Thunder Bay Police Service mishandled the original investigations. The loss had a devastating impact on the family, and it was only 2 months later that Arizona also died by suicide.
Knowing her, I think she just felt defeated and just let herself go down more and more. She lived in Winnipeg and she just drank, did drugs, like heavily after Naya died, and I think she just said, "F it, Naya did it, why can't I do it?"
Following Arizona's death, Robyn was allowed to spend only 1 night with Sasha, now the only sister she had left. Neither of them knew that it would be for the last time.
Do you remember the last thing you guys said to each other?
"I'll come visit you again." And it was during Arizona's, after her services. I said, "I'll come visit you again in a couple of weeks."
It's been over 6 years now since the suicides of Robyn-Lee Mathers' 3 sisters, Shania, Arizona, and Sacha Bob. Sasha's death report was completed in February of 2015. We only obtained it recently. The tragic circumstances that led up to their deaths have only left the family with more questions than answers.
This picture of my sister Sasha, and she has really big bags under her eyes. She looks like she's defeated in life, like she's lost. She feels nothing.
After the deaths of her 2 older sisters, 12-year-old Sacha Raven Bob continued to struggle. And according to her death report, the First Nations Child Welfare Agency responsible for her care, Weechi-it-te-win Family Services, repeatedly ignored her cries for help.
Sasha was asking to come stay with me. She wanted to. And then we were like talking and whatever, and you know, I just remember sitting on a bridge and just telling her, like, it's just us two now.
The agency pulled Sasha out of a treatment program she was attending against the advice of staff and placed her back into the care of her grandfather. No follow-up counseling services were arranged after she was discharged.
And then she's getting bullied at school. And what's really sad about it is everyone was saying, you're just using your sister's death as an excuse for attention. That morning, I guess she was getting picked on really bad, the morning of her death.
And the warning signs were all there. The day before she died, a friend of Sasha's found a suicide letter she had written. The letter was immediately sent to Sasha's caseworker at one of Weechi-it-te-win's community care offices. According to the death report, the worker received the letter at approximately 3 p.m., but chose not to notify anyone because, quote, she was almost done work by that time, and workers were not allowed to work overtime. When the letter was finally brought forward to the team on the morning of September 10, 2014, they again decided to wait and speak with Sasha the following day. But by that time, it was too late.
She left a note on the table. My grandpa showed it to me and it said, I'm sorry, Papa, I can't live like in this life anymore, but I'll see you in my next life. And my grandpa, he told me that he thought it was a joke, and he started searching the house, and he couldn't find her, and he finally looked in her closet, and he said she was already like half blue. She's already gone. He only missed her by like 20 minutes. I guess that's what the paramedics say or whatever.
We have to ask ourselves, are our children not of value? And so when we have these systems, all levels of government, if they do not place the children as a priority, then those systems that are that deliver inadequate services or lack of will continue.
Anna Betty Ashni-Peniskam has dedicated her life advocating on behalf of Indigenous children caught up in Canada's child welfare system. We met her here at the memorial site of another child who died while in care of a First Nations child welfare agency. Tammy Kiash was only 17 years old when her body was found here along this waterway in Thunder Bay, Ontario.
We're still losing our children in high numbers. And it's not only the child welfare system that needs to change, it has to be all the other systems as well. And the healthcare system and the education, all those things that contribute to why those young people choose death.
But with Sasha's case, Weechi-it-te-win had plenty of opportunities to intervene. The death report notes numerous occasions where Sasha talked about wanting to end her life. She cut herself, tried to hang herself, and wrote a number of suicide letters that Weechi-it-te-win were aware of, but did little to address.
When a child dies, when they choose death, when they commit suicide, while they're within custody of a child welfare agency, is there an investigation to determine as to what led up to it? Do they examine, what was the family dynamics, what was the history, and not to find fault or blame, but to learn from it so that it doesn't happen again.
We don't have the luxury of turning a blind eye to these stories. I think we need to sit down, we need to grieve about what's been going on, and we have to acknowledge that our government is a representation of us as a society. If we will not hold our government and our leaders accountable for what is going on in these situations and make sure they put all of the resources and supports and reimagining required right now in this crisis critical moment, then we are going to remain here. We will not move from here.
So who is accountable for the death of Sacha Raven Bob? The death report highlights numerous instances where Weechi-it-te-win failed to ensure Sasha's safety, and 39 recommendations were made to help the agency provide better services to children and families.
The deaths, one is too many if we could have prevented it. And sometimes we don't know everything in time to act on it. But when we have a report that tells us that we knew everything in time to do something about it and we just didn't, it's unexcusable.
APTN Investigates repeatedly reached out to Weechi-it-te-win Family Services Executive Director Lori Rose for comment. We asked her if she feels Weechi-it-te-win is at all to blame for the deaths of Sacha Raven Bob or her sisters Shania and Arizona, or if any of the 39 recommendations made in the death report were ever addressed. Our requests have gone unanswered.
You know, I hear the term quite often that our children are a commodity, that many organizations, that many systems benefit for the lack of services and resources for our children. And that is not a balance that our society should be proud of.
I think we are all responsible for Sasha's death. I think we have to look at the big picture. We can't sit down here and point fingers at each other or other organizations as it's your fault how we got here because you were holding the buck. It's not hot potato. These are lives we're talking about. This is our society, this is our culture, this is our community, these are our children.
Do you think the system failed your sisters?
Yeah. Everything that happened reflects back on them. Everything.